Hello, everybody, and welcome back to episode 45 of this AI podcast. In today's episode, again, with me is Joao, and we're discussing today of everything around agentic engineering. We talked about harness engineering, especially how you actually generate these important AI agent harnesses. And at the end of the episode today, we're also deep diving in how to actually look into the pricing of these harnessed agents. How do they actually create value, but how do you make sure you price this adequately, for example, with output-based pricing? But with me today again, Joao from Lisbon. How is life doing in the south of Europe?
It's good. We have good weather. We have time, and so far things are looking pretty good. However, things are not looking that good over at the cloud servers. But we'll get into it in a few minutes.
Bad weather on cloud services. Everybody's vibe coding. Everybody's using Claude Code. Again, my background today. But in the episode today, let me quickly make the segue into the first topic, which is harness engineering. A few months ago, we actually talked about already in regard to agentic skills. So basically equipping agents with context knowledge. For example, back then it was mostly just markdown files. In a sense, how do you actually generate a great LBO model for a financial agent or an Excel model in general? This was probably a little bit steamrolled and augmented in popularity when OpenCloud came out, and pretty much the agent then actually not only took specific skills from the markdown context, but also added new memory files into markdown. And this became all this, like, let's say a little bit loose context of this completely new agentic world that now we're living in. But the more components that we're actually adding to the agent, the more complicated it is for the agent to really orchestrate all these markdown files and tools and so on and so forth. So that is exactly why there's this reasoning on we need a structured approach, basically giving an agent a structured harness to actually yield the best possible output. So just in another way that I usually think about it is an ideal agentic harness is really optimized for the context for the agent that it needs to perform in these multi-step procedures a human actually asks the agent to do. So that's a little bit the way I think about it. But from your perspective, Joao, how do you look into the components of the skills and then translating that into great harness engineering?
We started by building tools, and initially we had like 2, 3, 4 tools, and that was good enough. You had a tool to search through files, one tool to go online, and maybe if you were adding, let's say, a Word document, you had some kind of tool to read the Word document and some other tool to edit it, make changes, text, whatever. However, as time went on, we demand more and more from the agents, and so now we're upwards of 50, 60, sometimes 100 and something tools for the agent, and we're now moved into grouping these tools as toolkits, as skills. Skills is, I think, a better name for it because it's not just a group of tools, but also some instructions on how to use them. If you're messing up with Word, you know how to edit the Word, what the style of the document that you're writing in should be. All that kind of information is not just a tool, but also usually some markdown file. Markdown is a bit of a constant with these kind of models. And you group them together, those kind of tools and those instructions, and you build up the skills. Because we quickly realized for the things we want to do, especially, I'd say coding agents are one of the most famous types of agents. They're very well developed and pretty popular by then across the board in all developers. You can easily have upwards of 100 and something tools available to your agent. And that becomes extremely hard for the agent when he's trying to implement a new button, implement a new feature on your website, and suddenly he has to read over 100 tool descriptions and decide what tool should be best used for this kind of job, maybe a sequence of tools. So we have to start grouping them into toolkits or skills, and then selectively, I'd say we have a toolkit just for browsing the web. And that's just instructions on how the searches should be, some tools on different APIs, different places to search the web on, some places to search the documentation on the platforms that you're using, and you group them so that the agent does not have the 100 and something tools right away available to it, but it can search and activate skills accordingly. So if you ask something, hey, what is the best way to, or what is the best framework I can use for this? It knows that it has to search somewhere. It has a skill it can activate. It sees a skill about searching the web. It activates that skill, and only then it can see the 4 or 5 different tools and some instructions on how to search the web. this is how you do context engineering so that you don't spam the agent with all the possible tools and all the possible buttons you can press, and you get the best results.
Maybe just to roll up this very briefly. So we came from prompt engineering, which is basically this very simplistic form of optimizing the input of a large language model, to then context engineering, which is then optimizing basically the input of the context window. You don't want to give the model all the trash that you can possibly find lying around, even if I see that occasionally actually happening. Let's just give everything to the model and the model should figure it out itself. But in context engineering, it's a little bit more like optimizing like a human kind of workflow as well. If you have a meeting in 30 minutes and you would want something from a CFO, like we quickly talked before the podcast, or you want to have something from an engineer, you don't give it everything you possibly know on finance or everything you possibly know on engineering. You curate this context, aka this 30-minute slot you have with a human. And very similarly in the agentic or agent world, you would curate the context to only give it mostly relevant concepts, like, for example, a tool description, a particular skill it needs to activate, and some other components, for example, how to actually maybe do an API call and which one you might actually need. There is also this, let's say, larger array that you should also not over-curate the context. There should still be some degrees of freedom that the model can somewhat have some clarity of choice as well. And there's this pretty much this balance that is then emphasized in this context engineering, let's say, workflow, that you would want to constrain it, but not too much. So you kind of have to find this middle balance. Ultimately, what you're, from a builder perspective, want to optimize is, of course, both the intelligence or the output, the value creation of your software, of your agentic system, for example, but at the same time, you want to minimize the cost you need to use and to deploy to yield that intelligence. So in other words, if you give too much context that is meaningless, you pay basically tokens for no good reason. If you don't give enough, you don't yield sufficient intelligence. So that's a little bit this like trade-off that you constantly have to do, and you can give partially of this decision back to the model, but not everything. So that's the world of context engineering. In harness engineering, it basically takes the whole world one step further, and we're trying to basically enable the value creation by putting this harness around an agent, around the large language model, or maybe a multitude of them, for it to then be optimally set up, for example, to be a coding agent, to be a financial analyst agent, to be a due diligence agent, a legal agent, or an agent in a call center. So you would basically curate the world around an agent in that particular case. That might, as you mentioned perfectly, Joao, include tools, include skills, include API, include any other component that you might actually need. Is there any particular way what you would be saying, for example, taking financial analyst agents as an example, where a harness has to have to yield a good agent?
You can have a rundown of the usual tasks you do if you're doing the task yourself. But the idea is never show the agent more than, I'd say, 30 tools at one single time. So usually for financial analysis, you need something to search the documentation, search some files you have about the company you're evaluating, about the market you're investing or playing around in, and also some tools to go online. But you also need some tools and some skill to maybe write down the report. If you're writing a report, then some skill to actually write into a Word document or it's a text document, some instructions on how the document should be parsed, how the formatting should be, because it is for the best, and it is somewhat simple to instruct the agent to write the way you want it to. Otherwise, you're going to have multiple iterations and it's going to cost you extra more money. And so you build up these skills and you try to group them mentally. And a skill is get information, is research, basically, and how to do research and the tools that you need to do that research in the documents or online. Another tool set is writing and creating the report. Maybe it's creating a financial model in Excel and you need some tools to actually play around with Excel, read the Excel, and how some instructions on how the Excel should be formatted, the formulas that you should be using. So group them into these toolkits or skills, and then have a brief description of the overall skill. So one skill could be, here's how you should interact with Excel. And the other skill should be, here's how you do research. And whatever task that you give the agent, you can then activate those skills. And only if it activates those skills, then you can see the tools related to it and the extractions related to it. That means you can have 100+ tools, but you don't have to show them all the time. The agent can actually go and search for the tools that you have available to then use them. You might have to wait a couple more seconds because instead of having the tools right away available, it has to search for them. It's a round-way trip. But it is usually for the best, because for 100-something tools that you have available, maybe 5 or 6 are actually going to be used.
I mean, one particular component here that I'm still struggling somewhat to kind of make sense of, especially if we talk about harness engineering just overall, is this topic on MCP. I mean, currently we believe MCP is the best practice to kind of have this connector between the agent and, let's say, the outside world. But I'm just like making sense more and more that it's fairly constrained what can flow through MCP's fairly structured and standardized protocol. Whereas if you have some more scattered markdown files fully laying around, I think there is just yielding a little bit more context to perform this particular task. So in other words, MCP is great, but it probably had the promise to be like a highway for data transfer. But so far to me, it feels a little bit like a train. So you can only do a particular request and you have to kind of course, wait, and it comes back with a particular response. And this is very limited in terms of context depth. Whereas if you have Markdown, or if you have an array of Markdown, or this entire harness, that is actually yielding a lot more context depth than just MCP. So I'm kind of curious to see if MCP is really the protocol we're adapting into the future. Of course, if you build on financial analyst agents or finance in general, or maybe some legal procedures like audit or like maybe insurance as well, you would want to have traceability, you would want to have some sort of governance structure so the agent doesn't go rogue in your organization. You need to probably customize the agent in the sense, or the MCP itself, okay, the agent cannot access at will particular resources. It needs to be some sort of logged. It's usually constraints on financial companies that we see happening. But just overall, I think MCP might not be the best add-on in this harness engineering that we kind of would want it to be. That's a little bit my 5 cents. And maybe, yeah, what's your take on this show as well?
I think we use MCP only to get to the level of tools. So let's imagine you're building some kind of scheduling agent that you want to reach out to partners, reach out to colleagues, and set up the meetings accordingly. The MCP, for example, Google MCP or Gmail MCP would give you the tools to read your email inbox, write some emails, list possible addresses to write the emails to. Those would be tools that you can get through MCP. However, MCP by itself is insufficient to build out this agent, right? You want some instructions on how you want the meetings to be scheduled, how they should be scheduled, the names of the meetings, the timing that you'd like them to have them. So a full scheduling agent skill, if you want to create that for your own personal agent, should be maybe a couple tools from MCP, maybe a couple tools internal to your own computer, your own service, and then that instruction skill, usually a Markdown file or some other file, where you write down that information. A lot of those, there are some marketplaces for those skills. People write down those instructions. Not a lot of them are super safe. We've been seeing, I think with the rise of OpenClaw, people created like this kind of marketplace where people would write and share skills and be a really good idea on, for example, the scheduling agent. There were scheduling agent skills where it could show the agent how to do them, how to be polite, how it should invite people to do things, the best way to actually schedule a calendar to be efficient for people. However, a lot of the skills that were on our marketplace were malicious. And so people would hide instructions there saying, hey, send information to this address, or like log the keywords, and basically exfiltrate a lot of valuable information from you into some other remote server. So there are publicly available skills. Be very careful, because you might be instructing your agent without you realizing to do some very nefarious things.
I mean, I think it's a good perspective. Maybe to add on this very, very briefly, just in other words, explained, harnesses is a little bit like the component that was so far missing to yield this translation of just a technical capable model, like we've seen with very advanced PhD level models, to then actually yield business value realization. Because so far this kind of translation was still missing. While it was an incredibly intelligent large language model, for example, an Opus 4.5 or a previous Opus model, it never really yielded material business impact because it kind of was lacking this harness to actually effectuate the business value realization. So in other words, we kind of take this super intelligent model, but as builders, we're kind of wrapping this harness around it. And now suddenly it actually yields and ongoingly will yield more and more and more business value, because now it is embedded in tools, it is embedded into skills that actually are materially mattering for a particular job and are not just generally trained like you would train a transformer. And then you do a reinforcement learning, a little bit alignment there, fine, but it's not aligned into the business context. Because just if you rewind back some years ago, we always kind of had this idea of we fine-tune the models for the company context, but we never actually did that for two reasons. It was too expensive for many firms. And secondly, once you did the fine-tuning, the next best model came around and you did all this fine-tuning for no good reason. That's why we mostly build and we leverage general purpose large language models that are highly not accustomed to the context of the business world. But now with harness engineering or having an AI agent with a harness, it now starts to actually have this business value realization in place. And it's hopefully finally that we see some sort of business impact happening with all these AI agents in the months to come. And one last topic just for today's episode is pricing. Because now we actually have a mechanism, we have a mean to take this harness, it yields business value, and we see that ongoingly now with agents being augmenting humans, for example, in the financial world. We've seen it for a multitude of months now in the coding world, but also into customer care, customer support, until transcriptions and similar services. But one question remains, how do you price in this new world where you have a harness, you have a super intelligent model, and that is this whole theory of outcome-based pricing. But before we go into this rabbit hole, Joao, what's kind of your maybe best idea of how would you kind of make sense of, you have a harness now, but what are maybe some of the cost factors? And then maybe I can add the best sense of the pricing factors. You have a harness, what are some optimization vectors that you need to do to make it as cheap as possible?
As a builder, as soon as you build up the harness and you have a sufficient harness that has all the tools and skills that make the agent or allow the agent to do what you want it to do, you get the idea of the minimum possible model that you can run on it that actually can use your harness. For any modern harness of skills, I'd say coding agent, but you can think of like a personal agent. So it has the ability to read emails, read your calendar, check something in your like smart home. Like a personal assistant kind of agent has maybe like 10, 14 tools that it needs to use. If I plug in a model like GPT-4, like the standard GPT-4 or GPT-4 Turbo, which is maybe 2 years old by now, that model might 99% certainty that would fail at most tests that you give it. Mostly because older models, especially simpler or dumber models, are not as optimized to use tools as the more recent ones. And even the more recent ones, you have 3 or 4 frontier models that people usually use. But if you're really concerned about privacy and safety and you want to host your own models, there's a wide variety of open source models you can run on them. But they also come in a wide variety of sizes and cost. So you cannot just choose the best possible open source model. It might not fit your hardware, and you might need $50,000 or $100,000 hardware to run those models. And so you have to get an idea of how intelligent, how advanced must your LLM, your AI model be to use your harness. From then on, then you can have a baseline pricing, because what we've been seeing is that the prices are not getting lower with newer and newer models. We had it in the first couple of years of Gen AI with GPT 3.5, 4, 4.1, Omni. Like each and every model was getting better and also cheaper. And now that's no longer the case. We're getting incremental increases. Models are still getting better, but they're being priced accordingly. I think it also relates to VC funding running out for these startups and for the inference. And so people actually need to charge you for those tokens. And if you're building agents around these models, you also need to charge your clients, your subscriptions, whatever, these tokens. And as soon as you have that baseline, you can have an idea of how much it costs for you to run that kind of model. And it is not as cheap as maybe it would be in 2 years ago, but you're also getting a much better model, and you can build much better and higher quality agents that do real business value.
Okay, so maybe if I translate it in other words, so you would work backwards from the required harness to yield the business value. So you kind of know what is required in terms of harness, and then you try to fit it in with some sort of a large language model that fits the harness. Or the other way around, if you think about it as well, I mean, you can technically build around an LLM the harness, but then the new model comes around and you're not model agnostic anymore, and you have to rebuild the entire harness. So that's kind of what we've seen also, like there is kind of this decision, are you entirely building around an Opus or a Sonnet, or you have like some sort of model agnostic harness that you can simply replace fairly fastly the large language model when it comes around. Very similar like it was before, you don't want to build your workflow and around a particular model. You also probably don't want to build a harness around a particular model, but rather have it more modular, have it more flexible. Once a new model comes around, most of the time this is a Claude model or maybe a Gemini model, and you can swap around the models and reharness it and then yield it into production in a fairly substantially short period of time. You might still need to do some testing, but that's kind of is an interesting facet as well. Not only do you have the regular testing procedure, you probably also have to retest your harness that you built around a particular model, which is a very easy segue then. Okay, fine. We have the harness, we have the large language model. How do we price this for the customer? And since it is now more or less derivable from business value realization, you can think about it as an outcome-based pricing. Because the conversation in a particular sales call or sales conversation might be, with this particular large language model, in other words, this particular agent equipped with a harness, which is business context aware, you can then materially improve a particular process. And from this process improvement, you would then yield a particular percentage as a return, or in other words, as a price for your service. This is not entirely new. So if we think about which type of other businesses do some sort of having a percentage of a value creation pricing, it's usually transactions in financial services. You have a transaction, of course, there's transaction prices that are fixed prices. So whatever the transaction is, it's just $15, for example. But most of the time in transaction prices, it's like a percentage. In other words, if you have this in the agentic world, you're implementing an AI agent that yields material business benefit, ideally with a harness, and it's fully functioning within an org, you can then probably derive in a particular workflow that it helps save a particular amount of money. And from that saving, you would then actually price it back to you as an owner of this AI software. As an example, if you have a financial analyst agent, just making things up, it would speed up the Excel model generation by an order of magnitude, or maybe by 20x. That saves a particular amount of hourly rates. And from this particular amount of hourly rates saved, you would then take a particular percentage and you would price it accordingly. You might still yield some sort of, or actually have the necessity to have a base pricing for your infrastructure, or some sort of a base price. But then ultimately, if you do outcome-based pricing with a harness, you're more aligning your agentic system to the client's best possible outcome. Because ultimately, what most of the salespeople, the good salespeople in the world, are selling, they're not selling software, they're selling outcomes. They're selling outcomes based on metrics, and these metrics are ultimately on a, for example, deal by deal size in terms of a financial analyst or a call center agent ultimately. So that's a little bit of this outcome-based pricing. It's kind of difficult because you need to know, okay, how much infra cost do we actually probably more or less need to yield that particular outcome? But once we do this successfully, we could then materially benefit from the upside of the company, because not only is it more aligned with the business, it's just also a little bit of an easier story than you have to pay by usage, like we've seen with AI. But what's your take on this, Joao? It's a new phenomenon.
I have that perspective from both being a builder, but also a consumer of this AI services. For the coding agent that I subscribe to, it has gotten a bit more expensive than it was in the past, but that cost value approach to it still very much applies, because I did the math, and the $100 or so that I pay for it, if I were to not have it, it would take me sometimes double the amount of time just writing the code. So planning by itself, I can still do it my own. I might be a bit slower because I don't have to actually manually research every single topic I have to interact with, but I could still do the planning by myself. But writing the code, it takes time. I mean, I type fast, but the models can iterate through files and just go to the right file and change the lines probably much quicker than I can, and it won't get distracted by notifications or emails or whatever. And so having this kind of model saves me, I'd say, at least 4 hours every day that I would spend on doing things that are just that much faster. And 4 hours of every day, of every single workday, it adds up to much more than $100. And I don't want to say it super loud, so I don't give ideas to Microsoft to increase their prices. But I want to just have that kind of in mind when they increase their prices, that it's still very much reasonable for me to pay that amount, because the value that I get from it is very reasonable, in contrast to what I pay. And I think as a builder, that's also like the goal that I try to do, is build a harness and have a model that's scalable enough that the value that it outputs is still much bigger than whatever it costs. And it should be much bigger than whatever it costs the client, and also much bigger than whatever it costs to run it. And those running costs, you can call it infra costs. It's inference plus the infrastructure plus the servers plus whatever your AWS bill ends up being. And because it is, as we've been seeing, increasingly higher, you have to just have a better and better agent to justify those costs.
I mean, it's a little bit of an emerging topic, this pricing of agents, but I think ultimately you can decide, just to make a high-level summary, between a usage-based pricing, where you basically say, okay, you have some sort of tokens or credits, or you have some sort of amount of workflows you can run per month. Just from my own experience in sales perspective, hardly anybody has this concept of tokens sometimes, unless you're an AI builder. So it's a difficult sell if you basically say, okay, I give you 10,000 tokens, whatever that means. So you kind of have to introduce this new lingo in also on top of your product. So that's the usage world. The second component is you have a fixed price tier like you would have in a software as a service, something we used to know for many, many years now. Costs you a flat $30,000 per month, and you can just use it how much you actually want. Might sound appealing, but if you have inference costs from Opus or from some other advanced models, that's north of 4 figures per day per user. It's probably not the best idea. And then there's this third component. That's kind of what we teased today. Maybe we can deep dive in a future episode once again. Outcome-based pricing, something we spent a lot of thinking on, but it's mostly this particular pricing that would align the best possible partnership with your client. And also, it would actually incentivize us builders to make our harness, in terms of the engineering of it and the large language model that's behind it, powering this all, as cheap as possible, because this would yield a higher margin, ultimately to then benefit again from the value that the agent is creating. Ultimately, we kind of have this conundrum that agents might augment / replace a specific substrate of employees. So we maybe also kind of need to start thinking about the value these agents are creating, and we are having a derivative of that in terms of our pricing as AI builders. But that's it, more or less, for the episode. Joao, anything more to add on harness engineering, skills, AI, context engineering, value-based pricing?
To give you a somewhat recent example of how much it can differ, like a quick request, a quick hey to an agent from an actual long-running agent that processes things, is using a harness, is using tools, going online to search for things, can cost you. One of the most famous coding agents is Cloud Code. I think by far it's like top 3 for the last year or so, very easily in the top 3 agents in the AI world. And that's always been token-based. Because people using Cloud Code know, at least have a concept of tokens, so you don't have to introduce that lingo like you were saying that you'd have to do for a business world. Microsoft had the GitHub Copilot and does pretty much the same as Cloud Code, but their approach to pricing it was slightly different. They price it by request. So it doesn't matter if you say hey, or if you ask for a super complex thing, like build me a button, plan all the things around it and the API endpoints and everything, and new database, it would cost you the same. To the user, it would be the same. It would cost you like one request. And you'd get, let's say, 1,000 requests per month or 5,000 requests per month. And I think the last week or so, they just quit that approach entirely. Not because people were saying hey a lot, but because people realized that they could just ask really complicated stuff and they always get billed the same. So might as well get really complicated tasks right away and maybe bunch up a bunch of tasks that were independent or that you're going to do in a row. Because the models are not good enough to do them sequentially, you can just say, hey, build me this and this and this, and then by the end of it, write me a report of everything you've done and push everything to Git or publish this website. And so instead of wasting 7 or 8 requests, they'll do it all in one go. Microsoft caught up to that, I think, they're not having the greatest of times affording that bill for the inference. And so they cut that down, and now you're paying for actual usage. They don't fully display how many tokens you're using. I think they're still keeping them to themselves. People have realized that for long-running requests, you can see your usage bar, and the bar keeps going up throughout the requests. It doesn't go up just one single time. So you can see like one of the biggest companies in the world with one of the biggest agents in the world. They're all going token by token, but it is remarkably harder to market it to business or people not in the AI world, because what the hell is a token for people who are not in the AI world?
Exactly. I mean, I think it's a good point to wrap up the episode. I think ultimately, if you're a hyperscaler or a large lab, it's probably more selling towards engineers currently, at least that's what we've seen. But if we more and more customize harnesses, you as AI builders in the audience are, I think it's more and more moving and shifting into this outcome-based pricing, where you can basically go in, steer the sales conversation in the sense that your agentic system might yield saving X or augmenting of revenue Y, and you have taken kind of a share, then you have an incentive, again, to make your input that it needs to actually execute that as cheap as possible, as effective and efficient as possible, and at the same time maximize and use that leverage that you're creating for the client. Because ultimately, this seems to be the most win-win situation. You seem to have the biggest margin. They seem to be having the biggest impact based on your agentic system, on your AI agent with harnesses, basically. Whereas if you basically just say, this is a flat fee, I think that's mostly dead in AI, and or usage-based. Because what if you kind of approach the end of the month and you have 7, 10, or 15 employees that still want to use the system, but they kind of used their usage? I think there's a tendency that they would rather use a competitor for a few days that actually pay more usage or augment their usage budget. So that actually drives away probably great retention of your software, as opposed to actually yielding a material benefit financially. But that's it. Joao, for episode 45, it was a deep dive on agentic engineering, was a deep dive on harness engineering, context engineering, AI agent harnesses and their benefit, and their pivot also to outcome-based pricing in this new world of agentic artificial intelligence. It was a pleasure to have you on episode 45. We're approaching the 50s, and for everybody in the audience, new episodes out every single week. We're active mostly on YouTube, but also sometimes on TikTok and LinkedIn. So feel free to connect, drop a comment, and see you in episode 46. Bye-bye.